Hello and welcome back to Bug Fables Community Choice with your host Phantom A. Today we are going to look at what you picked as the best V attacking skill in Bug Fables. We had roughly 240 votes and there's 5 skills to choose from. Let's look at them all from worst to best. In 5th place we have V's heavy throw skill with 5% of the votes. Which, if I'm being real, yeah, I have to agree with this placement. For 5 TP, she throws her boomerang so hard at the enemy that it actually lowers their defense. Which, you know, sounds really strong when you consider the fact that V does really well against enemies with lower defense anyway. The problem though is the 5 TP cost is actually really heavy just to do that. And yeah, the initial throw does decent damage, but that's still a far cry from her other skills. I think the biggest problem with the skill though is that both Kabu and Leaf have better ways to reduce defense. Leaf's break costs less TP, and he's also a character that in general struggles more with defense anyway, and Kabu's deep taunt may only last for one turn, but it's also even cheaper TP wise. And since it's baked into a redirection move, it's honestly very easy to spam. The only real draw to heavy throw is just if you don't catch it, you take recoil damage, which can be useful for getting yourself into danger so you can activate last attack and last stand. If you're not planning on manipulating V's HP to danger though, well yeah, this skill has nothing really of value to it. It's not really a bad skill, it's just very heavily outclassed. In 4th place is Needle Toss with a mere 7% of the votes. V will split her boomerang into 2 and throw them as needles at enemies. The real draw to this skill in my opinion is the fact that it ignores all defense, not just one point like say Hurricane Toss does. This skill also benefits from having medals that actually give status elements to V's needle attacks. So here's a very likely hot take, but I'm actually surprised that this skill is below Needle Pincer. I mean, the tossed needles do a little less damage than the pincer needles do, but I think what's really helpful to know about needle toss is that if you really wanted to, let's say with sleepy needles, you could throw one needle at an enemy to try putting them to sleep, and if you put them to sleep, you may not want to hit them again because if you do, then they'll wake up the very next turn. And yeah, putting an enemy to sleep at all means they'll lose the next turn anyway, but drowsiness lasts for 2 turns, not just one like say numbing needles do. This is also the only one of V's skills that's capable of hitting multiple targets, not just one. And the damage itself really isn't that much lower than Needle Pincer to be honest. Meanwhile, Needle Pincer does not give you that flexibility. And if your attack stat is very high and you have multiple targets you want to focus on, hitting a second target after your first makes contact resets your damage to what it was from the beginning of the attack. So in some fringe cases, Needle Toss may even do more damage. I talk about this more in another video, but feel free to watch this to the very end first so we can check out that video later. Don't worry, I'll link it in an end card. In any case, that's just one man's opinion. Personally, I'd rank Needle Toss higher, but if you want to say it's 4th best, well, by all means. In 3rd place, with 8% of the votes, we have Tornado Toss. In this skill, V throws her boomerang at the target and hits multiple times. Each subsequent hit does 1 less damage than the last, and it cannot go lower than 1. This skill is V's bread and butter. It's strong, it's cheap, it has beautiful synergy with higher attack stats, and it just rips through anything without defense so well and so reliably. That being said, I think that 3rd place is actually a pretty good spot for it. While the skill is very strong against foes without defense, the fact of the matter is that most bosses at least have one. And so often, this skill is just outclassed by Hurricane Toss. But it's not always outclassed. Against foes like say Venus Guardian, a Honey Nation, the Watcher, even the Wasp King, the lower TP cost does come in handy, and reducing the defense from 1 to 0 doesn't really matter very much there, because without extra attack on V, you're only doing like 1 extra damage for 2 more TP, which is not worth it at all. As for when Hurricane Toss is preferable, well, we'll get into that later. For now though, Tornado Toss, very solid move all around. It's also nice that V actually starts with this skill at the beginning of the game, and so there's plenty of chances for this skill to be very useful. That being said, I understand why it's not ranked any higher because, well, it is inferior to its younger yet stronger cousin. In 2nd place, we have Needle Pincer with 10% of the votes. Much like Needle Toss, V splits her boomerang in 2. But instead of throwing them like needles, she approaches the enemy on the ground and stabs them with pincers. Much like Needle Toss, this move ignores any and all defense from your foe, and it's also a bit stronger than Needle Toss is too. I understand though that this skill seems to be very preferable in tough bugs where everything has very high defense, and if you give V a lot of attack power, then yeah, it makes a lot of sense that this skill will be above Needle Toss. At least when you're only focusing on one target and you don't want to attack anyone else. Otherwise, I'll be honest, I don't see myself using this move at all. Like, Needle Pincer is not a bad move. In fact, I would still say it's better than, say, Heavy Throw. But unless the frontmost target is just so big that you cannot reach them with Needle Toss anyway, I'd probably just save the 1 TP and use Needle Toss instead. Which is not only not restricted to what it can actually target, but the thrown needles also know to ignore the targets that already have 0 HP and instead hit a different target. Maybe I'm missing something here, but if you all want to educate me on why this skill is so useful, I'd love to hear it. But regarding V's skills, I honestly think that Needle Pincer and Needle Toss should have their positions switched. And finally, in first place with a whopping 70% of the votes, Hurricane Toss. This skill is basically Tornado Toss, but it does additional damage to foes with at least 1 defense point. Just about everything I've said about Tornado Toss applies to this skill too. Though Hurricane Toss does have one pretty big notable advantage, and that's that if a bow has natural defense, like say how Cacklings have 2 defense, or let's say a Seedling had 1 defense because it was unharnessed, reducing that defense to 0, and Hurricane Toss will still do an additional point of damage on the first hit. So instead of 2-1-1-1, it's 3-2-1-1. And this is on top of whatever V's current attack stat is, so alongside say Leaf or Kabu skills to reduce enemy defense, a high enough attack stat, and Hurricane Toss effectively does an additional 4 damage over Tornado Toss. That's actually a pretty big deal, and that matters a lot early game, where lots of bosses have at least 1 point of defense. Hurricane Toss has other advantages too. For example, it can flip enemies over. And if push comes to shove, it's the only skill that V has that can uproot enemies that are burrowed under the ground. So ultimately, if Tornado Toss is V's bread and butter, then Hurricane Toss is effectively her Swiss Army knife. It's an all-around fantastic skill that's usable in basically any situation you could think of. Though I'm not sure I'd say it's definitively better than Tornado Toss. And really, it's just for the simple reason that not every enemy and boss has defense. Though depending on the situation, getting the extra 4 damage for say 2 extra TP could very well be worth it. Or 5. You know, I never bothered to bring up the ADBP enhancer, but it's there if you wanted it. All the same, Hurricane Toss, fantastic move, and I can at least see why it would be number 1 on this list. If you want to educate yourself on how offense works in this game, click the video on the screen right now. It explains offense as well as I possibly could hope to do in Bug Fables. Until next time, thank you for watching.